August 7th, 1945, 10 a.m., a cramped, dim laboratory in Tokyo. Dr. Yoshio Nishina stares at a telegram until the characters blur into meaningless ink. Outside, the summer heat is a physical weight, thick with the smell of charcoal and the distant rhythmic thump of anti-aircraft drills. But inside the lab, the air is frozen. Nishina, the father of Japanese nuclear physics, a man who once studied alongside Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein, feels a coldness in his marrow that no Pacific sun can touch. The report from Hiroshima is impossible. A single bomb, a single flash, an entire city erased from the map. The Japanese military leadership is screaming for answers. They call it a new type of bomb, perhaps a massive conventional explosive or a chemical fluke. But Nishina knows. He looks at his own equipment, small, hand-calibrated, and powered by a fluctuating electrical grid that dies every time the B-29s fly overhead. For years, he has told the Imperial Navy that a uranium bomb was theoretically possible, but practically decades away. He estimated that no nation on Earth, not even the Americans, could possibly coordinate the industrial power required to enrich enough uranium-235 in the middle of a global war. He was wrong. You can almost feel the silence in that room as Nishina realizes the scale of his miscalculation. While his team was struggling to scrounge enough copper wire for a single primitive cyclotron, the Americans weren't just fighting a war. They were reinventing the laws of existence. To understand the sheer horror of this realization, you have to look at what was happening in the hangars of the Imperial Air Force at that exact same moment. While the United States was perfecting the sun on Earth in the secret city of Los Alamos, the Japanese Empire was literally digging in the dirt. By late 1944, the American blockade had turned Japan into a starving island. The lifeblood of modern war, oil, had stopped flowing. The invincible Zero fighters were being grounded, not by enemy fire, but by empty tanks. The solution? A desperate nationwide mandate, the Pine Root Oil Project. Imagine tens of thousands of Japanese schoolchildren and elderly civilians, armed with shovels and handsaws, trekking into the forests. Their mission was to dig up the rotting stumps of pine trees. These stumps were heated in crude outdoor stills to produce a foul-smelling, resinous oil. It took 200 pine stumps to produce a single gallon of usable fuel. It was a process from the Middle Ages, performed by a people who had run out of options. The contrast is haunting. In Tennessee and New Mexico, the Americans had built the Oak Ridge and Hanford complexes, gargantuan industrial cathedrals that consumed more electricity than entire states. They were using silver borrowed from the US Treasury to wine magnets because copper was too scarce. They were operating at the very edge of human knowledge, manipulating subatomic particles with the precision of a watchmaker. And in Japan, they were trying to power the world's most advanced fighter planes with the juice of crushed trees. Nishina boards a plane for Hiroshima later that afternoon. As the transport flies over the Japanese countryside, he sees the smoke from the pine root stills rising from the hills like funeral pyres. He knows what he will find in the charred ruins of the south. He knows that the gap between pine roots and atomic fission isn't just a gap in technology. It is the sound of an empire hitting a wall of reality it never saw coming. When his boots finally touch the ash of Hiroshima, Nishina doesn't look for survivors. He looks for the soil. He pulls a Geiger counter from his bag, a device he built with his own hands in a lab that lacked consistent running water. He waits for the click, and in that clicking sound, he hears the truth. Japan wasn't just losing a battle. They were fighting a ghost from a future they didn't believe existed. But the most terrifying part wasn't what the Americans had built. It was how they had hidden the sheer, staggering magnitude of their advantage until the very second the world turned white. Section 2. The Ghost of the Superfortress. To the average Japanese citizen in 1945, the war didn't look like a clash of ideologies. It looked like a silver speck in the sky. At 30,000 feet, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress was more than a bomber. It was a ghost. It flew so high that the air was too thin for Japanese interceptors to breathe. Their engines would wheeze and stall, their pilots gasping into primitive oxygen masks as they watched the B-san, the Honourable Mr. B, glide serenely overhead, untouched by flak or fighter. Inside those pressurized cabins, American crews flew in shirt sleeves, heated by the friction of a machine that cost more to develop than the entire Manhattan Project. But on the ground, the Imperial Japanese Army was facing a reality that was rapidly regressing into the 19th century. While the Americans were perfecting the remote-controlled turret systems of the B-29, Japanese engineers at Mitsubishi were under a different kind of pressure. They were ordered to build the Shusui, the Autumn Water, a rocket-powered interceptor based on German designs. It was supposed to be the silver bullet that would finally reach the superfortresses. But there was a problem that no amount of samurai spirit could solve. Japan had no high-grade fuel left for rockets. You can picture the scene at the Optima airfield. Engineers in tattered lab coats, mixing volatile hydrogen peroxide in ceramic vats because they had run out of stainless steel. On its first flight in July 1945, the engine failed. The pilot, Captain Toyohiko Inuzuka, managed to glide the plane back toward the runway, but he clipped a building and died in the wreckage. Japan's high-tech hope was a charred heap of plywood and metal scrap. This was the technological chasm. Japan was struggling to get a single rocket plane off the ground, while at that very moment, 3,000 miles away, the silver plate B-29s were being modified with specialized bomb bays. These weren't for standard firebombs. They were being fitted with the most complex mechanical assemblies ever devised by man. Mechanisms designed to slam two pieces of subcritical mass together at the speed of sound. The disparity was so extreme it was almost surreal. While the US Navy was deploying radar-guided BAT missiles, the world's first fully automatic guided weapons, Japanese High Command was authorizing the Fugo project. These were literally paper balloons. They were made from washi paper glued together with potato flour by schoolgirls. The plan was to launch these balloons into the jet stream, hoping they would float across the Pacific and start forest fires in Oregon. Imagine the mental state of a Japanese general looking at a map of the world. On one side, he sees his nation's best hope: paper, balloons, and pine root oil. On the other side, he hears reports of a mysterious shimmering flash that can turn a city into a shadow. The Japanese NIGO project, their own attempt at an atomic bomb, had been a disaster of logistics. Dr. Nishina had asked for a few £100 of uranium. The military brought him back a small bag of black sand from a mine in Korea, contaminated and useless. He needed specialized pumps to separate isotopes, pumps that required precision ball bearings. But the American blockade had sunk the ships carrying the steel needed for those bearings. The Japanese atomic dream ended, not because they lacked the brains, but because they lacked the bolts. In the United States, General Leslie Groves was moving mountains. He didn't just order pumps, he built a factory that built the pumps. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the K-25 plant was the largest building under one roof in human history. It used a process called gaseous diffusion that was so complex some of the world's greatest scientists said it wouldn't work. But Groves didn't care about theoretical limits. He had the infinite checkbook of the American taxpayer and the raw, unrefined power of an industrial heartland that was just hitting its stride. By the summer of 1945, the United States was producing enough enriched uranium to fuel a weapon of mass destruction every few weeks. Meanwhile, Japan's highest priority military project was a special attack manual that taught soldiers how to strap explosives to their chests and crawl under American tanks because they had run out of anti-tank shells. The realization was beginning to filter through the upper echelons of the Imperial Navy. The Americans weren't just winning the war, They had moved the goalposts of civilization. They had turned the very fabric of the universe into a weapon, while Japan was still trying to figure out how to keep its last few destroyers from running out of coal. But even as the ash settled over Hiroshima, there were those in Tokyo who refused to believe. They argued that the Americans must have used up their entire supply of miracle material on that one bomb. They gambled that the US couldn't possibly do it again. They didn't realize that in a small, humid room on the island of Tinian, a second assembly team was already turning a series of silver-plated screws on a device nicknamed Fat Man. Section 3. The Assembly Line of Gods. August 9th, 1945, 11:02 a.m., above the Urakami Valley, Nagasaki. The air over Japan ripples again when the second plutonium core, the Fat Man, detonates with the force of 21,000 tons of TNT. The shockwave doesn't just shatter windows in Nagasaki, it shatters the last remaining delusion in Tokyo. The Japanese High Command had gambled on a desperate theory that the Americans had spent every gram of their miracle material on Hiroshima. They believed the United States had performed a scientific stunt, a one-time trick to scare them into submission. But as the mushroom cloud over Nagasaki climbs to 40,000 feet, the terrifying reality sets in. This wasn't a stunt. It was an assembly line. Back on the island of Tinian, the 509th Composite Group was operating with the cold efficiency of a Detroit car plant. While Japanese generals were still debating if a nuclear reaction was even possible, American technicians were already unpacking crates for the third, fourth, and fifth bombs. They had more cores sitting in specialized lead-lined containers, waiting for their turn to be bolted into silver-plated casings. The technological chasm had become an abyss. You can almost see the faces of the Japanese War Council as they receive the news of the second city's destruction. They are sitting in a bunker beneath the Imperial Palace, the air stale and smelling of damp earth. They are discussing Ketsugo, the plan for a final suicidal defense of the home islands using bamboo spears and human bombs. Outside that bunker, the Pine root oil project was reaching its peak. Millions of hours of human labor had been spent digging up stumps, yet the total output of fuel was barely enough to keep a single squadron of planes in the air for a few days. The fuel they did produce was so acidic it ate through the engine's gaskets, causing the very planes they were trying to save to catch fire on the runways. The contrast is the most haunting realization of the entire war. On one side of the Pacific, a nation had regressed so far that it was literally trying to squeeze blood from trees. On the other, a nation had unlocked the fundamental energy of the stars. In mid-August, Dr. Yoshio Nishina is called back to Tokyo. He is no longer just a scientist. He is a witness to the end of an era. He stands before the leaders of the empire and delivers the final, crushing verdict. He explains that the Americans haven't just built a bigger bomb. They have mastered a new branch of physics that Japan cannot even hope to replicate for decades. He tells them that the war is no longer between armies, but between the present and the future. The Emperor's voice, recorded on a vinyl disc and broadcast to a stunned nation on August 15th, captures the moment perfectly. He speaks of a new and most cruel bomb and the need to endure the unendurable. But for the scientists like Nishina, the unendurable wasn't the surrender. It was the knowledge of how far behind they had fallen. When the first American occupation troops landed, the Japanese were stunned by what they saw. It wasn't just the tanks or the planes. It was the small things. They saw American GIs throwing away half-eaten chocolate bars. They saw trucks that never broke down and radios that worked in the middle of a jungle. They saw a logistical machine that could deliver ice cream to a carrier in the middle of a combat zone, while Japanese soldiers were starving to death on bypassed islands. The sun on Earth was the ultimate expression of that power, but the gap was visible in every bolt and every gallon of high-octane gasoline. Japan had entered the war believing that spiritual power could overcome material inferiority. They left the war realizing that no amount of spirit could stop a nation that had learned how to mass-produce the apocalypse. As the smoke cleared over the charred landscape of the Pacific, the world was left with one final, chilling image. The rusted, abandoned stills of the Pine Root Project sitting in the shadow of the atomic age. One empire had spent its final breath digging for the past. The other had reached into the heart of the atom and pulled out the future.